Fred Britton. I am the Chief Information Officer from the great state of Maine. I'm excited to be here, and I'm joined by my fellow panelist, Ron Bouchard, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for Government Solutions with FireEye. And FireEye has been a kind of a long-term partner here at the state of Maine. We work with these folks using software from them, managed services. We've brought them in for a couple of incidents. So a long-term partnership with these folks, so I'm happy to be presenting with Ron. A couple just tidbits about Maine, pretty small rural state, only about 1.3 million residents. Probably all of you know that we're kind of famous for lobster. What you don't know is a couple other very important things. First off, you may have never met a real Mainer. I am not one in the state of Maine. If you talk to the old timers, they'll tell you that unless your parents were also born in Maine, you were not a Mainer. And the expression they will use, and keep this one in mind, is if a cat has kittens in the oven, they ain't biscuits. And then one other small fact about Maine is we are the global leader in black flies. So based on that, the state government, we're a single, Maine IT is a single organization for all technology across the executive branch. We also work relatively closely with the legislative and judicial branches. So relatively big charge in a wonderful state. And so Ron, I'm gonna hand it over to you, and if you would talk a little bit about the threat landscape as you folks see it kind of from the global level, and then we can get into some discussion.
Great, thanks Fred, really appreciate it, and appreciate the audience and the time today to talk about really important topics around cybersecurity and privacy. And in particular with the, with the challenges we're all dealing with today from a work from home environment and remote work situation, of course, due to COVID and the pandemic that we're all figuring our way through as we go. Just a few quick words on FireEye as a company. We're a global leader in cybersecurity solutions and expertise, and that's a key intersection that we think about when we put together our strategies for our customers, especially in the government mission space. So anything that has to do with critical infrastructure protection, national security missions, and protection of citizens' privacy. We hold it. We do this in three main ways as an organization. We focus obviously on some technology components that have to do primarily with monitoring and observing suspicious and attacker behavior and identifying that behavior in unique ways. We combine that telemetry and that intelligence we learn from the technology side with our services component. So that includes a number of solutions around both managed services, our professional consulting services, our incident response capabilities, our red teaming functionality, as well as many third-party integrations into that solution space. And then we glue it all together with our intelligence capabilities. So we really bring together experts from around the world to say more insightful things about what those technical bits of information mean, combined with the larger picture of what we're seeing in client and victim environments, and we're able to make analysis decisions as well as strategic and informed learnings from what we tie together with that intelligence capability. So that combination of expertise, technology, and intelligence really what powers what we do as an organization. So moving into the conversation around what are we seeing from the perspective of organizations and functions and missions that have been forced really quite rapidly to move into this work from home state. First and foremost, I want to present an observation that I've personally had over the past 2 years or so. Been with Mediafire now for almost 8 years, but and when I started at the organization and coming from U.S. Department of Justice, prior to that, we had a lot of, I would call them very distinct silos of threats in cyberspace. Of course, we had the traditional nation state actors, the advanced persistent threats out there that were focused on access into and long-term access and data theft into key systems. We've always had crime as long as we've had cyber, or as long as we've had the internet, and financially motivated activities that have evolved over the years from traditional or simple credit card theft and financial fraud now into more of the extortion, ransomware tactics. And of course, we've had this element of somewhere on the spectrum of politicized speech combined with hacktivism or activism, and of course terrorism nexuses, through internet-enabled capabilities. Those areas, all those elements, are starting to blend together in a number of important ways from what we observe. Number one, that the tools that were previously only available to nation-state actors are now becoming much more commonly available to any actor that cares to either spend a little bit of money or a little bit of time researching those tools or those cyber weapons. So the capabilities of everyday average, if there is such a thing, cyber actors has greatly been enhanced over the years because of access to nation-state or nation-grade cyber weapons. Similarly, we've seen an intersection of traditional nation-state groups really starting to delve into some, I guess, quasi-criminal activity. We recently put out a report on APT41, which is a Chinese threat group that we've been tracking for a number of years. In addition to the traditional espionage activities that they've always perpetrated, we've actually observed them, taking on traditional, almost criminal activities, fraudulent wire transfers, those types of things in recent months and years as well. So you start to have this blending of motivations, tools, capabilities, and sharing of tactics as well. So what that means for you as a defender or as someone who's managing that risk in an organization puts a lot of additional strain and pressure really to understand who's targeting you and why. Before, you might have said, well, I don't really care about the state-sponsored actors. I really only care about criminal groups, or maybe I only care about disruptive attacks. Now it's hard to tell exactly who's going to be targeting you and for what purposes at any given moment. And the landscape is rapidly evolving as well. Again, previously we had these epochs of criminal and cyber threat activity that really took years to evolve and change. Now we're seeing rapid evolution of both tools, capabilities, and targeting in matters of months or weeks as threat actors adapt to new defenses and new targets of opportunity. So a few key statistics that we track in our annual, what we call M-Trends report. These are all of our information that we gather as part of our investigations throughout the year. You see a few key statistics. Obviously, from a threat targeting perspective, the wheel on the upper right, government's always going to be a nexus of targeted attacks. And then when you think about the financial aspects, especially payments and sensitive data around state level or local level financials, I would combine those two in the bottom there. And really, you're looking at a 25, almost a quarter of all attacks. You're somewhere in that nexus of focus for actors. This dwell time statistic that you see in some of these charts, that's the key statistic we think about when it comes to risk. Why? Because we've learned over 25, 30 years of cyber that it's almost impossible to stop every attack. So what's your key risk mitigation factor? It's how fast can you get the cops to the bank when the alarm goes off, right? It's how fast can you respond when someone's broken into the organization to stop what they're doing and kick them out. Unfortunately, this number, while it's been going down, is still in the order of 2 months on average for most of our clients, which is simply too long for most threat actors, especially when you're dealing with the more aggressive ransomware extortion types of attacks, which typically we see payouts, or at least the attempted payouts of those, happening between 3 and 10 days after initial compromise. And then the last thing I want to leave you with on the bottom left there is, what's the effectiveness of detection by source? What that means is, to us, there's always a place for governmental or oversight or partner-driven cybersecurity, but nothing beats having your own organic understanding of your environment and your business operations and your risks. And you can see the difference there. It's almost a full month of differentiation between, actually more than that, it's 2 months between external notification or detection and if an organization can internally detect and respond to their own issues or breaches. Of course, that statistic has also been shifting over the years. It used to be almost entirely external. Organizations have gotten better about internally developing security operations capabilities, but that's a statistic that we anticipate will continue to be driven down as organizations continue to invest in this area. And then moving on to access challenges, especially in a remote setting, as we've rapidly shifted into this COVID period of operations. And depending on your outlook, it may last well after the pandemic has been resolved to some extent. I do see some systemic shifts that may be occurring in certain industries where work from home or large scale remote worker access will continue to be a large portion of business operations for the foreseeable future. Fred, I really wanted to get your thoughts here on some key challenges, or as you were working through, some of your first tactical, or I'll call them rapid response at the beginning of moving a large workforce into a remote, posture. What have you seen in terms of immediate challenges, and then what do you see potentially on the longer term horizon once you've gotten over that initial surge to think about from a security and resiliency perspective?
Okay, thanks, Ron. And thanks for breaking it into kind of short and long, because I will say that as we went and COVID hit and we said, okay, within 2 weeks we had everybody home, the mentality going into that was simply, we've got to keep the government lights on. And so that means a lot of risk. It means a lot of deployment at a pace that one wouldn't think to be reasonable, highly risky. And so, I sort of looked at, looking back, it was kind of the ultimate stress test for both infrastructure and organizational skill. So I think we had probably the same story as many of the other states. There we go.
All right.
Which was
one of the joys of working from home.
Working from the office was the many kind of, it felt sort of like the movie Apollo 13, where there's one crisis, you deal with it, you think you're going to catch a breather, and you're rolling quickly into the next, saying, how are we going to handle this? And that went from, from the internet links to licensing capacity. How are we going to amp up hardware capacity for this massive influx of phones that people really weren't interested in anymore? And this is kind of where we had a lot of security pieces starting to roll in. We were about halfway through a full-blown MFA rollout. So all of a sudden we have people going home, and we're saying we really need to continue that rollout in the same period of time, taking some things that we really weren't prepared to do, like putting a pause on password reset, saying we can't afford to have someone's password expiring in this very moment. The rapid deployment of laptops, I think we all experienced getting things home. That includes, did we allow for personal devices in a way we probably wouldn't have in another time? Video conferencing was something I was sharing when I came to state government about 1.5 years ago. There was almost none. And when I first said I'd like to do a presentation in this modality, people said, we don't normally do that. And we had begun to adopt it, but we weren't really quite there yet. We had a couple of products that we had said, these are going to be the ones in the portfolio. Lo and behold, one of them had some serious issues around various regulatory compliance. So we had to start to get some messaging out saying, you're welcome to use this particular platform, but not for confidential information. If you're discussing, the specifics of things that are covered by CJIS and, so on and so on. So we had to look at that. And another area that we saw a lot of ramping up was in using people moving to soft phones and not having an infrastructure that was really set for remote soft phones. So that's kind of the rapid deployment of our VPN product, which we had the hardware in place, but there were so many desktops and clients out there that were not set. So I think that was sort of the biggest push for us. And in the midst of it, realizing the traditional support model of the help desk number wasn't going to be enough. People were really struggling. And so some of the staff said, let's begin to do office hours every single day. And so we would open up these video chats for a few hours every afternoon and say, you can call the help desk or you can pop in. We'll probably be talking about VPN and MFA and soft phones. And sure enough, so people were sort of pouring in and we were getting a lot of feedback. So we learned some things in that, saying, well, people really like that. How do we continue that into, sort of our standard quiver? But the important thing here is it was keep government going. So what we were looking for was more that black and white, can you connect, can you do your job, and not necessarily the quality of that connection and the experience of doing that work. And so as you ask about longer term, and I would compare this to, for those of us that were involved in Wi-Fi rollouts many years ago, the very first rollout we did was coverage. We want to get as many square feet blanketed with Wi-Fi as we can, Our second generation was coming back saying, okay, we've got the coverage, but now we got to focus on density so that people not only have a signal, but it's giving them a positive experience. And so they were kind of moving into that. And this is where some opportunities abound. I mean, we were delighted to receive CARES funding. I think we've made a pretty strong case here in Maine around why securing our remote workforce is an appropriate use of CARES funding. Our administration is in agreement. They think that's important. The challenge around CARES funding is that by letter, by the criteria, one has to have spent it and actually reaping value from it in this calendar year. So, we are in the moment of trying to push out a number of projects that run from increased network segregation, enhancements around our cloud email systems, and more detection, recognizing we don't have the same level of visibility, so we want to get more agent products out there. The other thing around security that we recognized is we had a VPN product that we could scale and get the people connected, but lo and behold, the product has a bandwidth limitation per person. So they could get their job done, but with limited bandwidth, and keeping split tunneling in place to keep that commodity traffic off of that piece of software. That's not good enough. So part of our overall project plans are also looking, tackling other VPN products to say, how can we move into a full tunneled approach and sort of stretch that out to secure things even at a greater pace. Another area that I think is going to require far more attention is, I know if we all go back to a year ago as we were thinking about remote work policies, it was a little more abstract at that point, was what is a clean space requirement, right? We've all said everyone's got to get home, and we've sat in meetings with the kids blowing through, and right, people are in their kitchens, they're on the couch, but those are not what our remote work policies look like in general, right? We're saying we need you to have a dedicated space. We need to make sure you don't have papers laying around with confidential information. We really want to make sure your kids aren't coming in and playing Penguin City or whatever it is when you're not at your desk. So there's a number of things that are now coming into play where we have to lean on policy as well as user education. Those policies around you shouldn't be checking your Gmail on your on your state device. Now that people are sitting in their own living room, the transition between work life and home life is not clear. And so there seems to be more traffic around that. So really pushing on those policies and thinking about how we can do greater lockdowns and manage that is becoming pretty important. I think that it's the long-term strategy about how do we make the experience virtually the same. Our governor has a desire she wanted to have a roadmap that by 2030, 30% of state government work would be happening via telework model. We hit 80% of the executive branch was working remotely. So drop in the bucket at this point. She can have that tomorrow.
Yeah, I like what you said, the analogy regarding kind of the Wi-Fi model, right? Which is the way I liken it here is, you rolled out some general coverage, you went back and beefed that up from an availability and resiliency perspective. And then maybe you started to think, oh, we should also add encryption to this, right? And maybe some monitoring around it. And I think that's where a lot of organizations we see that's the evolution they've gone through. As you said, Fred, it's been a massive acceleration. I know a lot of our clients have had plans that are 5 or 10 years in the making for these kind of transitions, and they're doing it in 5 or 10 months. So that does introduce challenges. And the other risk I'll talk about or I'll highlight is, again, unfortunately, the adversaries in this space are just as informed about what organizations and people are doing and what they're challenged with as you are. Immediately at the beginning of the pandemic, in the February-March timeframe, we saw a massive campaign by several what we attributed to be state-sponsored actors targeting remote access systems, Citrix, Cisco, VPN, concentrator vulnerabilities across almost every industry. And we observed about 80 to 100 clients who were targeted by this attack, in a very short period of time. So while you're trying to build that capability and put all those components in place and figure out a policy, unfortunately, you can break into the same systems and do damage. So I think, the words you said around being thoughtful around keeping government running, but while also, putting some resiliency or building some plans for, at least response capabilities into those, what are at first maybe, kind of makeshift or emergency, types of infrastructure architecture, as you transition those to a more permanent state, thinking about how your security staff operates remotely, or how they can access these remote systems in a secure and fast way to analyze, something that may be suspicious. We're seeing a lot of that challenge now, to either bring your own device or personal devices that you have access on them, and how do you, if you have a suspicion of an issue, you don't want to fall back to the old model, which is have your employee, mail that device in, or try to walk them through a manual process of forensics analysis. Ideally, you have that remote hands capability on those systems, and your security staff can also, from a remote location, perform those functions. But building that in takes some thought. It takes some time to both on the technology side as well as the people and process side to make that happen. So I appreciate that point. And as you pointed out, I do see the CARES Act was tremendously valuable, especially in the beginning stages of, shoring up some funding for emergency use. To your point, I do think there's going to be some consideration going forward about how much of that, based on the legislation, what is really fully available by the end of the year, and will there be some changes to that or some tweaks to allow for additional investments over a longer period of time, which I personally feel is probably required given the complexity that we're dealing with here, but we'll see where that ends up, from a policy perspective. On the threats and risks side of the house, Fred, I really wanted to get your opinion on, in addition to those challenges, what have you seen, what have you observed at a state level, or what have you been working with your security teams, both at the state and local level on, what are they seeing, either employee challenges, physical risks and lost devices? Are you seeing, issues with BYOD assets or unmanaged assets coming into these new environments? Are you seeing or suspecting things like, sharing of credentials that, personal to work or state level that may be compromised? Those kind of challenges. Those are commonalities we've seen across a number of industries, and certainly in the government sector. I'd be curious as to hear your thoughts on where you're starting to see or where you have seen some of those risks come into play.
Sure. You covered the rapid increase in the threat actors' behavior, and I think that was certainly mirrored here. And that's, you were just talking about sort of the internal stuff, but the first thing we saw was, I think in the first 2 months, the statistics were we had a 90% increase in scans of our network, malicious scans of our network. We had a 30% increase in phishing attempts. So, I think our staff have done a marvelous job, and I don't mean the IT staff, I mean the executive branch staff, about the cautions. I'm very appreciative of some of the statutes that are in place around information security training, awareness training, behavior, sort of give us a shout if you see something that you think is suspicious, and I think they've done a marvelous job there. I will say, as we're moving into perhaps the most difficult time in this, and the thing that worries me the most is what's going to happen in about 6 weeks. We have an election, and throwing that in the midst of COVID and remote work, I believe is putting us at some tremendous risk. And I know a lot of folks are talking about how do you beef up your election security, but I think there could potentially be more to it than that. I mean, I certainly am among those that, and we get paid to be paranoid. So I am among those thinking that some of these nation state actors are sitting on some rather unique tricks, and they're saving it for the 11th hour. But as they do that, and we look at our own election and we watch the political turmoil and unrest occurring across the nation, we're starting to worry about violence. And so what happens if all of that really explodes in the midst of COVID? And so as we're preparing for election day, and we're doing, our CISO is leading tabletop exercises, and we have some of our vendor partners on retainer prepared to sit with us, but these are not on site. These are not in person, and not knowing what's going to happen yet, we're sort of backing out and saying, what is our role as well in that kind of a response? And so the places that worry us are, we know that we're responsible. We'll leave emergency management to the emergency management agencies and the public safety groups, but we are responsible for government communications, right? So the networking, the phones, the state website. And so we're starting to say, how are we going to handle these kinds of threats, which might be in the form of cyber, and they may come in other forms. So we're looking at leveraging the state radio network for critical IT personnel, leveraging FirstNet, and actually trying to be prepared for what's going to happen when we're not on site. I'm going to translate that back to cyber in the COVID environment, saying we need to be prepared. We are accustomed to, here in Maine, we had a big event about a year ago, and FireEye folks had come in and given us a hand with that. But we established the war room, right? We were in person, we had people, and we had solid communications, which we could potentially lose in those kinds of a situation. So those are the things that are really worrying me, probably more than some of what our own staff are doing at the moment, because I think they're a major threat to state government. And as we know, these actors are waiting for, they wait for the natural disaster and then they hit. And so being prepared, saying we could have a very rough November, and that means increase in cyber attack. So nailing down in these projects we have in flight, although we have a December deadline for CARES reimbursement, I am of the mind that we actually have a November deadline because we need those facilities in place.
Yeah, Fred, I really like what you said about the intersection of both the election, challenges and pressures, along with what the threat actors are honing in on. And I do agree, something we've observed, and I've spoken on this topic as well, is obviously a tremendous increase in just destructive malware and ransomware and extortion attacks at the state and local level. We've seen almost an 800% increase generally in the US over the past few years on those types of attacks. And just this year, we're on pace for about a 300% increase. And that's just pure volume. The sophistication and the capabilities of those attackers are increasing very rapidly as well. My worry is, as those primarily financially motivated actors are accessing infrastructure in order to extort a payout, they're hitting everything they can. And in some cases, we are seeing, interconnected election systems, maybe not the core election systems, but things like voter registration systems or vote reporting systems for election night reporting, websites, things of that nature. And we have seen, evidence of a few what we consider maybe more advanced actors putting access into those types of systems, potentially pre-positioned. And DHS has been involved with a few of those investigations around the country as well. Nothing that I would constitute as a significant focused attack, but I do worry about that pre-positioning and what might happen a week, a day before the election, combined with all the additional challenges we have around. Look, any outage at this point is going, first and foremost in everybody's mind is going to be, is it a cyber attack? Even if it's a simple, internet outage or a simple application, downtime or something like that. So you're going to be under a lot of pressure along with all of your peers here, in thinking through those responses, those communications, having those playbooks at the ready to both get the answers, get the facts, use good judgment in terms of how you respond to what you're seeing, and build that trust with your constituents, with the stakeholders, and make sure that you can respond appropriately. So not an easy task, and a lot of work still to be done, I think, in the next 30 or so days here, 100% on that. I wanted to kind of delve into, based on all the badness we just talked about, all the bad things, what are some positives? What are some key things that you've looked at your level, at the state level? What are some things that maybe kept you up at night in the past that you've put controls in place, or you built some capabilities around that give you some assurances either on that first line of defense to prevent those attackers from getting in the first place, or if they do happen to get access somewhere, to stop them from getting further into the environment, or to gain access to your crown jewels, your data, your systems.
Thanks, Ron. I want to appreciate the slide you've put up covers the sort of the breadth, and this is the challenge, right? Is we really have to look at the detect, the defend, the respond, all of those areas. And while it's tempting to say this area, we think there's a bigger threat here, that's really not an option for us, because as we know, any hole in the boat, the water's going to leak in.
Mm-hmm.
So this has actually been an opportunity for us. The CARES funding has presented opportunity to come at this and say there are a portfolio of increases that we need. Our perimeter has changed, right? So that idea of all the efforts we put into network access control, I'm glad we did it, but we have far less devices plugging in inside the ship. So, that's important. Recognizing that we've spent a lot of time defending the cloud, email, and sharing environment, the desktop on the things we know about, but now we're moving into, and we've started really patching third-party products out on the client machines has become all that more important. The gaining visibility, those data center firewalls that we've all looked at and spent some time, that needs to be enhanced. So it's actually been a nice opportunity because we have a narrative that goes with it. Right, we've been gearing up to talk with the legislature. It's been almost a year since we started saying cyber, cyber, cyber. They're very supportive. The CARES money comes through. So what we came at this with was the portfolio. We've wrapped up our MFA implementation. We're looking at privileged access management and beginning that process. Really looking at this as an opportunity to kind of take a breather too and reduce server vulnerability counts and try to establish better processes around that. And in fact, I think many of us have maybe experienced as all of our agencies went remote. Once we got them remote, we got a little bit of a breather as they were still trying to reestablish their own service to citizens, where we could kind of say, all right, we get a breather, and how do we now get some of this in place? And then in comes the CARES money. So I would encourage people, just look at the portfolio, the full portfolio, and I think you've laid out this rather nicely.
Yeah, it's a great point. Sometimes I think about cybersecurity almost like quicksand. The faster you try to get out of it, the faster you try to fix your problems, the deeper you sink into them. Unfortunately, I'll pivot off of what you said and just amplify a couple of key points from our perspective. One is testing assumptions, validating what you think you have in place, both from a key controls and an asset perspective. And doing that on a regular basis is absolutely critical. I can't tell you the number of incidents we deal with where a customer said, we thought that environment was air gapped, or we thought that environment was completely isolated, or we didn't even know that environment existed until the attackers told us about it. So asset management and inventory management and key control assessment and validating those things on a regular basis is really your foundational element to everything else you're going to do here, because that really gives you that spotlight on exactly what you have, what the adversaries see, right, from their perspective, and where do you need, where are the biggest holes, to your analogy, Fred. You're going to have several holes in the boat, unfortunately. Which one's the biggest, right? Which one do I have to put that Flex Seal on first and foremost before I move to the next one? And ideally, you can do several of those at a time, and certainly the funding will help. But of course, some of these require structural changes, or they might require disruptions that you're not willing to do. You're not willing to take those risks right now, ahead of an election, or dealing with COVID and remote workforce. So there are real world, operational considerations and other impacts that have to be considered in addition to just the pure security outlook. So I think that resiliency combined with that visibility and validation really puts key decision makers in a good position to understand what risks they have and make informed decisions about where to focus their efforts and investments over the long term. So I think with that, we are going to wrap up this session. I believe there will be a few question and answer sessions available after this to get some audience input and feedback, as well as additional questions on what we've discussed today. But I want to pause there and thank Fred and thank the audience for the time today. And hopefully this was an informative session on the challenges and cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities associated with a large and ever-growing remote workforce situation. So thank you, everyone.